Welcome. Tonight we step into the weird world of 14th century French fashion where shoes got so long they needed chains. And yes, someone eventually died. You find yourself trudging along a cobblestone street in medieval Paris. The sun setting in streaks of burnt orange behind steep rooftops. Around you, the world smells faintly of roasted chestnuts, burning wood, and something less pleasant you try not to think about too hard. Street vendors cry out about eel pies and wax-sealed letters, but your eyes are fixed like everyone else's on the shoes. They're everywhere. Curled, coiled, ludicrously long shoes, poking several inches, sometimes over a foot, past the toes. They bounce, sway, even jingle, as if the wearers are auditioning for a circus. But this isn't a parade, it's daily life. Welcome to the time of the Poulaine, those ridiculously extended, pointed shoes that make modern clown shoes look understated. This is a world where footwear isn't just for walking. It's a statement, a rebellion, a flotation, and occasionally, a death sentence. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive a single day wearing them, unless you've mastered walking with a cane and toe chains while dodging horse dung and pickpockets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where we're unwinding together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You may not have heard of Charles V of France before tonight unless you've done some very niche Googling, but is about to play a starring role in this odd tale. Long before sneaker drops or red-bottom stilettos, Europe had its own fashion war, and it began with a pointless. Our story actually begins centuries earlier, with the Crusades. Knights returned from the East, not only carrying stories and souvenirs, but also tastes. Among them, the curved toe shoes worn in Turkey and Persia. There was something exotic about that silhouette, something glamorous. They caught on first with nobles, then with everyone else. By the early 1300s, a long toe meant long coin. People of status began sporting shoes that stretched several inches past the foot, and if you were especially rich or foolish, you went even longer. Historians still argue whether the earliest Poulaine wearers genuinely liked the look or were simply following a trend that escalated faster than anyone expected. Either way, the spiral had begun. What started as a subtle nod to luxury quickly morphed into a length contest, and you don't want to know who was judging. By 1350, this trend had grown legs and very long toes. Poulaine, or Krakow, as they were known in England, took over the courts of Europe like a creeping vine. Shoemakers began extending the front with cloth, leather, and even thin whalebone supports to prevent collapse. In the case of one particularly bold duke, rumor says his Poulaines were so long they had tiny bells at the tips. Never heard of her. There's a reason fashion historians and, let's be honest, even medieval clergy couldn't stop commenting on these shoes. Poulaines weren't just a style statement. They were crafted to change the way you moved. They forced a more upright, deliberate, and dignified gait. Think of it as the medieval version of the influencer strut. Try sprinting down a narrow alley with 2-foot-long leather spears on your feet, you'll get the picture. Even at the time, people saw how ridiculous they were. Writers mocked the trend, artists caricatured it, and satirists turned it into comedic gold. One poem even quips that the only thing more puffed up than a nobleman's shoe was his ego. It was medieval mockery at its finest. And yet in spite of the mockery, injuries, and high price, the Poulaines only got longer. Some nobles reportedly got stuck in stairwells, their shoe tips bending backwards like straws. To counter this, tailors began reinforcing the toes with metal wires. Some shoes even came with tiny chains you had to strap to your knees just to avoid face planting. Imagine trying to go upstairs like that. Go ahead, picture it. There's one story half history, half myth about a courtier who tripped mid-dance at a royal banquet and fell face first into a roasted swan. Naturally, the shoes were blamed. Tragically, did not survive. Fashion, as it often does, wobbled on the edge of absurdity. Eventually, Charles V, known as the Wise, decided enough was enough. But not right away. Until then, Parisian streets echoed with the scrape and shuffle of exaggerated footwear. Vendors sold Poulaine extensions. Servants were tasked with cleaning the elongated tips. And those too poor to keep up. Let's just say the sting of fashion exclusion was especially sharp. Pause for a moment to take it in. During a time when bathing was optional and starvation a real threat, people still paid good money to make their feet look like they belonged in a sword fight. Talk about priorities. And still, here you are, drifting through candlelit Paris, watching the nobility totter past butchers and starving writers. Every clack of a pointed toe on cobblestone is a reminder. Fashion stops for no one, not even common sense. And you, dear listener, have only just begun the journey. You're back on those same cobblestones, but something's shifted. The air feels hungrier, the face is older, and the shoes, well, somehow they've gotten even longer. You sidestep a man whose toes now curve like the handles of an ornate teapot, rising dramatically into the air like they're reaching for heaven. He looks proud, smug, even, which is impressive considering he's just tripped into a cabbage cart. Tonight, you retracing the origins of the real Poulaine Krasner social bloodstream. It begins with knights, doesn't everything? They return home from the Crusades, sunburned and battle-scarred, but glimmering with the glow of foreign wonder. These weren't just men of war, they were trendsetters, and tucked among their spoils were pointed-toe slippers worn by Eastern nobility, especially Turkish and Persian men. Practical, not particularly. Flashy, absolutely. At first, only the higher circles of French aristocracy dared adopt them. These were the same folks who wear squirrel fur in July and commission portraits of their elbows. You know, the type. But something about the sharp, elongated design of these imported shoes hit a nerve, or a vein, maybe both. They whispered of luxury, decadence, mystery, and, above all, difference. Historians still debate whether the early Poulaines were an intentional act of rebellion, or just another way to flaunt wealth. Either way, French courtiers couldn't resist. They began modifying their own shoes to reflect the exotic silhouette, using soft leather, sometimes imported from Spain or North Africa, and elongating the toes just enough to raise eyebrows but not yet trip over rugs. Then, competition struck. Someone made theirs an inch longer. Then, before long, shoe length was the medieval equivalent of a luxury car rolling proof that you were ahead of everyone else, even if you were quite literally falling behind in your stride. Artisans caught on quickly. Shoemakers, seeing gold in those pointy little tips, began crafting shoes for every noble who asked and charging extra for toe reinforcement. This is where Poulaine construction gets interesting. To keep those tips from collapsing or curling too soon, tailors use stiffened fabrics, sometimes inserting rolled moss or fine wire inside. Some even use dried reeds or Imagine telling your friends, "Don't step there. My shoes are full of herring." For those who could afford the indulgence, this wasn't just footwear, it was architectural. Long, sleek, and absurdly expensive. Poulaines demanded space and attention. Imagine walking into a dimly lit banquet hall, chandeliers flickering, and having to swivel sideways just to navigate the chairs without jabbing someone in the shin. One particularly notorious example comes from the court of Burgundy, where a minor noble named Etienne reportedly commissioned Poulaines over 30 inches long. According to a court diary entry, he had to use a silver-tipped cane to maneuver and employed a young page whose sole job was to carry his toe. Fashion's first intern. But it wasn't just the wealthy who took note. The middle class, always eager to climb the social ladder, began mimicking the elite. That meant buying longer and longer Poulaines, albeit with cheaper materials. Poorer shoes meant more frequent collapses, which meant more accidents. It was a feedback loop of tripping, bandaging, and bravado. Meanwhile, city streets already challenging thanks to open gutters, the occasional rat parade, and mysterious splashes became obstacle courses. Try skipping across a plank bridge over a muddy ditch. When your shoe tips extend past your natural step, go ahead, we'll wait. There is a recorded incident from around 1361 where a merchant's apprentice in Rouen fell face first into a market trough after catching his shoe on a nail. The entry notes, extreme bruising, minor concussion, and loss of two Naturally, he blamed the shoes. By now, the obsession had taken on a life of its own. Portraits from the era began exaggerating shoe length to emphasize status. Religious woodcuts intended as moral warnings accidentally turned into trendsetters. "Don't be like this sinful man," they said, pointing to a cartoon villain with comically long Poulaines. "Ooh," said the masseuse. Even the terminology evolved. The French word Poulaine likely stemmed from Poland, due to the shoe's popularity there. The English called them Krakos, again referencing a sort of early fashion hub, but the core message remained the same. If your shoes weren't obnoxiously long, you were doing it wrong. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Tailors began complaining about demand exceeding their capacity. "Another foot-long toe," one likely muttered. "Do they know how leather?" Meanwhile, The clergy, ever vigilant about vanity and improper gaits, started whispering that this foot fad was a sign of moral decay. Like TikTok dancers, but by the late 1350s, even commoners were trying to keep up, leading to a hilarious and occasionally dangerous fashion clash in city centers. You had merchants elbowing past bishops, both accidentally stabbing each other in the feet with ornate shoe daggers. It's around this point that murmurs start reaching the royal ears of Charles V. He hasn't acted yet, but the clock is ticking, the toes are growing, and the nobles, they're getting cocky. Still, you walk among them tonight, the candlelight flickering off polished leather, listening to the soft, rhythmic clack, clack of overly long Poulaine's tapping stone. There's something hypnotic about it. Something almost beautiful. Just don't try running, or jumping, or really doing anything other than posing. You can almost hear a tailor chuckle in the background. Ah yes, Monsieur Jacques wants them 2 fingers longer this time. He says he's meeting a duchess, and so, like all good trends before, it powdered wigs, waist trainers, or absurdly long nails. The Poulaine is now firmly rooted in fashion history, and it's only getting started. You shuffle down a dim hall in a Parisian chateau, passing tall candelabras and velvet wall hangings, and hear them before you see them tap, scrape, clack. A trio of nobles emerges into view, each strutting with a slow, unnatural rhythm. Their shoes extending so far forward they nearly cross the threshold before the rest of them did. One of them is clearly winning the unofficial competition. His toes curve up nearly 3 feet and are lacquered in crimson. Naturally. Welcome to the height of Poulaine pandemonium. It's the 1360s in France, and shoe tips have become the new battleground. But this is no longer just a style flex. It's a full-blown cultural arms race, and the toes are growing longer by the season. By now, Poulaines aren't just footwear. They are statements, and walking ones at that. If your tip doesn't graze a table leg when you sit, are you even trying? The upper crust has made it clear. Length equals status, and the lengths, dear listener, are getting absurd. Some noblemen are reportedly wearing shoes with tips that reach up to 30 inches past the toes. That's longer than a newborn baby, and just as difficult to carry. Historians still argue whether these extra-long shoes were purely decorative, or if people actually tried walking around all day in them. But the records show one thing for sure. They were worn to be seen. This was red carpet energy only. The carpet was probably muddy and filled with chicken feathers. As the elite try to outdo one another, footwear becomes a new kind of silent war. Shoes become codified language. A 10-inch toe might mean you're an up-and-coming baron. 15, you've probably got land, a title, and some tragic poetry hidden in your desk. 25 inches, that's not a shoe, that's a threat. Shoemakers capitalize on the craze. Special molds are created. Leather importers begin inflating prices, and cobblers now charge more to reinforce longer toes, using everything from bundled fabric to hardened parchment. There is even a record of one duchess requesting her husband's Poulaines to be lined with unicorn hair. It was probably goat. Of course, logistics become a nightmare. Walking through narrow doorways becomes a coordination exercise. Servants are often sent ahead to warn people of an incoming noble and their sweeping shoes. Some even carry little bells or clackers to announce their arrival because fashion, naturally, must also be theatrical. And then, of course, the chains arrive. Yes, you heard right. By the late 1360s, Poulaine lengths have reached such extreme proportions that nobles begin chaining the tips of their shoes to their knees or belts to prevent tripping. These chains are sometimes made of decorative metal links, and in one case, gilded silver. Some even have small gems embedded in them. Imagine walking around with bejeweled foot shackles, just to keep from eating cobblestone. The irony is that the chains make the walk even more awkward. You now have to shuffle, slightly bent, like you're perpetually sneaking into a room you're not supposed to be in. But nobody dares complain, because complaining implies poverty. And in 14th century France, few insults hit harder than looking like you can't afford longer shoes. The drama bleeds into the social fabric. At court functions, people size each other up not by armor or titles but by footwear. A longer Poulaine could upstage your political rival. At a wedding in Lyon, 2 guests reportedly had to sit in separate rooms because their shoes were so long they couldn't physically fit at the same table. Fashion said no. Even artists and poets joined the party. Illuminated manuscripts from this period begin illustrating not saints or martyrs' boot shoe competitions. One image shows a line of noblemen standing like flamingos, one foot raised, each toe longer than the last. Another marginalia sketch scribbled beside a psalm shows Death himself, wearing Poulaines, tripping over a gravestone. You'd think someone would speak up. Someone does. The clergy. Church leaders start to fume publicly. In sermons across France, bishops denounce the new fashion, calling it Satan's stilts, and accusing long shoes of encouraging pride, lust, and general sinfulness. Meanwhile, Parisian parents are trying to rein in their teenage sons, many of whom now want extended toes like their role models. One urban ordinance even bans the sale of Poulaines to unmarried men under an age restriction usually reserved for alcohol or crossbows, but the kids find workarounds. Young men stuff extra cloth into the tips of shorter shoes, creating fake length, like stuffing socks in a medieval code piece. Oh yes, it existed. If your Poulaines didn't leave a mark in the dirt behind you, you are nobody. The absurdity reaches new heights literally at masquerade balls. Attendees begin wearing themed Poulaines, decorated with tiny bells, feathers, even embroidered religious symbols. There is an anecdote from a 1368 banquet where a nobleman had his shoes painted to look like dragon heads, with the tips forming snouts that breathed incense. No one remembers his name. Everyone remembers the shoes. And then there's the injuries. Records from town physicians. They kept notes on this mentioned twisted ankles, sprained knees, and at least one broken nose from a trip and fall involving sharpened toe leather. Some historians believe emergency care at this point starts to quietly factor in fashion-related wounds. Still, it doesn't stop, because that's the paradox of fashion. The more absurd it gets, the harder it becomes to quit. The Poulaine becomes a kind of visual drug, a spectacle so embedded in daily life that to give it up would be to vanish socially. And so, as you sit at the edge of a crowded square, watching nobles teeter on their extended toes while commoners roll their eyes, you begin to realize this isn't about shoes. It's about identity, status, and stubborn pride. These people aren't walking in shoes. They're walking in performances. You lean back, listening to the distant clink of another chain snapping as someone's Poulaine folds like a cheap tent. Somewhere, a tailor rubs his hands together and draws another measurement. The stage is set. The fashion is extreme, and the king is about to step in. That's when the fun begins. Welcome to the age of shoe chains, swagger sticks, and fall hazards. Because when your footwear becomes longer than your lunch, you have to start compensating elsewhere. Let's begin with the chains. We touched on them before, but now they're practically part of the uniform. Nobles and ambitious merchants are regularly seen fastening their shoe tips to their knees with thin metal links, silk cords, or braided ribbons. These aren't accidental solutions, they're designed that way. In fact, some Poulaines are made with built-in loopholes for the very purpose. Engineers of fashion, if you will. You spot a man trying to navigate the steps outside the Paris cathedral. His Poulaines are so stiffly chained that every movement looks like a marionette trying to climb stairs. He makes it halfway, catches one toe on the edge, and nearly tumbles into a basket of hymeneals. Not a sin, technically, but definitely frowned upon. Some nobles go the extra mile. They start carrying swagger sticks, short rods, or canes. Not for defense, but for balance. These accessories quickly become fashionable themselves, carved with family crests or tipped with silver animals. Imagine watching a man in a velvet doublet using an ivory stick to gently prod his own shoes forward. That's where we are now. One documented case from 1370 involves a minor baron in Reims who fell into a well. Nowhere is the battle more visible than in church. If you think the clergy was already grumpy about shoes, wait until they started seeing them inside holy buildings. Parishioners clacked up the nave, Poulaines squeaking against stone, some dragged so much that worshippers left behind scuff marks on sacred floors. At least one cathedral in Tours hung a sign warning, "Those who come to pray must first remove their pride." One friar posited that they mimicked the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Another theory floated around that they resembled the horns of devils, that one caught on among town criers. "Beware the fork-footed man." They'd shout, as if someone's elongated instep signaled imminent moral collapse. Meanwhile, satirists and street performers had a field day. It is a world where the length of your shoes says more about you than your words ever could. And as absurd as it sounds, it made sense in the theater of medieval France. Your walk was your wealth, your wobble, your worth. But behind palace doors, tucked into scrolls and council records, a new whisper is growing louder. Enough is enough. The king has noticed. The complaints are stacking up, and a crackdown is coming. You're in the shadowed halls of the Louvre, not the glass pyramid version, today. But the medieval fortress, stone-walled and drafty, it smells of candle wax and cold iron, and in the center of it all sits a man in a high-backed chair, parchment in hand. This is King Charles V of France, known as Charles the Wise. Not because he was especially charming, he wasn't, but because he had an annoying habit of being right, especially when it came to things like politics, war, and apparently shoes. This is the moment the fashion party gets a wet blanket, the royal ban. Charles V has seen enough. It's the year 1368, and the king already dealing with war, economic woes, and some frankly chaotic nobility decides that ridiculous shoes are the last straw. People are falling in fountains, priests are tripping in churches, merchants are missing deadlines because they're busy untangling their feet. So, with a scratch of a quill and a few muttered oaths, he drafts a sumptuary law regulation about what people can and cannot wear. These weren't uncommon in medieval Europe. In fact, sumptuary laws were often about preserving social order, making sure peasants didn't look too much like nobles, and that everyone stayed in their lane, fashionably speaking. But this one, it zeroes in on Poulaines. The decree reads something like this: "Let it be known that the excessive lengthening of shoes being a matter of vanity, impracticality, and sin is henceforth forbidden for clergy and royal court." It bans shoes that extend more than 2 inches past the toe. That's right, 2 inches. From 2 feet to 2 inches. Talk about whiplash. You can almost hear the collective gasp echo through the halls of Paris. That's shorter than a walnut. What are they supposed to do? Walk like peasants? Charles V, ever irrationalist, backs his decision with arguments. Long shoes are impractical, morally suspect, and this is his favorite part: disruptive to the dignity of the court. In other words, stop looking like idiots. He even has supporters. A handful of bishops applaud the law. One archbishop writes that, finally, the foot shall know humility again. You imagine a congregation politely nodding while discreetly hiding their pointy shoes under their pews. But here's the thing. A law is only as powerful as its enforcement. And, well, enforcement in 14th century France? Let's just say it involved a lot of paperwork and not nearly enough enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether Charles V genuinely expected this to work, or whether it was more of a symbolic gesture or a royal slap on the wrist to say, "I'm watching you, Count Philippe, and I see those new Either way, the noble class is unimpressed. Within days, Reports start flooding in from courtiers and merchants who are very much still wearing outlawed shoes. One Parisian tailor even starts marketing his Poulaines as 2 inches inside the law, stitching a discreet flourish just above the tip to signal defiance. It doesn't help that Charles V isn't exactly known for his swagger. A brilliant administrator. Not quite. He prefers dark robes and functional shoes, and once famously referred to velvet as a distraction. Not exactly the kind of guy trend chasers are dying to imitate. Still, he tries. He orders royal guards to inspect footwear at court functions. There's an actual shoe check station at the entrance to certain halls, where attendants measure Poulaines, like TSA agents, with measuring tape. One chronicler describes a noblewoman sobbing after her tocops are trimmed on the spot. You imagine the sound of scissors slicing through leather, but the resistance is fierce and stylish. Nobles begin hiding their Poulaines beneath oversized cloaks. Shoemakers introduce collapsible tips that fold under when approached by guards. And most brilliantly, a group of young courtiers popularizes a double shoe trick, a short outer shoe worn over a longer, hidden. Think of it as medieval fashion smuggling. Charles V is not amused. He issues a second decree, this one even more stern. It includes fines, property, confiscation, and social penalties for offenders. But again, enforcement proves ... leaky. The shoemakers' union threatens to strike. The nobility shrugs. Some simply wear shorter shoes inside the palace and switch to the long ones the moment they leave. One scribe jokes that the new decree lasted as long as a cup of wine at a noblesse breakfast. There's even a satirical song that begins to circulate in taverns across Paris. The lyrics, roughly translated, Charles the Wise bans the toe, but mine still grows and grows. 2 inches. Oh no, I need 12 to steal the show. You hear it hummed by barmaids, whistled by stable boys, and badly sung by drunk dukes. The law has not killed the trend, it's only made it spicier. Still, the church tries to help. Several bishops begin refusing communion to men who wear the devil's footwear. One zealous priest allegedly holds a bonfire of confiscated shoes in front of the cathedral. It smells of leather and rage. 3 days later, the fires are mysteriously out and the shoes are mysteriously back. This isn't a royal decree anymore. It's a fashion rebellion, and like all good rebellions, it's petty, flamboyant, and deeply committed to the bit. So, as you stroll through a twilight-lit square in Paris, watching the parade of nobles clacking along in shoes that defy the king's command, you realize something. Charles may have the crown, but the Poulaines, they've got the people. And, in France, that's a powerful thing. You're standing in a narrow alley behind a tailor's shop, the faint scent of tallow candles and wet wool in the air. A low door swings open and a man peers out. He's darting, cautious. He beckons you in, revealing racks of luxurious garments, and tucked away in a far corner a hidden collection of shoes with dramatically long, gleaming tips. They're illegal. They're glorious, and no one's stopping. Welcome to Fashion versus Authority. Round 1. Charles V's decree has officially hit the streets, but the streets aren't having it. Despite the royal ban, tailors ignore the law, nobles chuckle at enforcement, and an entire shadow economy of rebellious cobblers and buyers takes root. The king may be wise, but the shoemakers are crafty. It starts with the capital. In Paris, high-end tailors begin advertising their services in whispered code. Fashionable footwear with noble proportions. Custom tips to match your ambition, and made for walk-in, not for measuring. These ads spread through word of mouth, inked onto tavern tables, and scrawled in margin notes. The message is clear: we're still making Poulaines, don't tell the king. And the buyers come in droves. Historians still argue whether this wave of quiet defiance was truly political or just vanity dressed up in protest. Either way, the reaction is swift and widespread. Aristocrats order secret pairs and carry them under cloaks. Even clergy members discreetly commission slightly extended toe caps for ceremonial purposes. Yes, Father Henry, we're all sure that's for God's glory. Some tailors move underground literally. Cellars and side houses begin functioning as black market cobbleries, complete with guards and coded knocks. A tap dash tap ... tap 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 gets you in. Inside, it's a world of velvet laces, brass toe cages, and custom leather dyed in rich oxblood and nightshade. The more illegal, the more desirable. Meanwhile, nobles play a double game. In court, they wear modest, rounded shoes always, carefully within the legal limits. But outside the palace, it's all pomp and points. One famous noblewoman, the Duchess of Anjou, reportedly traveled with 2 sets of shoes, one for her royal appearances, and one for more honest expression. That second pair had silver bells on the tips. The irony here is delicious. The very people who make the laws the aristocracy are now the ones smuggling, faking, and flaunting them. Royal guards tasked with checking shoes often look the other way. Some are bribed. Some are just tired of arguing with men whose Poulaines are longer than their spears. And then there are the tailors themselves, who've found a million creative ways to bend the rules. Detachable toes, snap-on tips that could be removed and replaced depending on the social setting. Toe sleeves, soft, decorative extensions that wrap around the front of otherwise legal shoes like a sock, but more jegging hidden supports. Flexible rods stitched inside the leather, invisible to the eye, but capable of holding outrageous shapes. It's basically shoe corsetry. Fashion finds a way. The result is a strange public theater. At court events, you see stiff, sensible footwear. But just beyond the palace gates, the same people emerge with shoes that look like medieval pool noodles, arching and curving with confidence. It's not just about vanity anymore, it's about resistance. Wearing Poulaines becomes a way to say, I'm above the law, or perhaps, the law is silly, and I am fabulous. Satirists take up the cause. A popular street pamphlet titled The Royal Tomocks, Charles V's decree, with a cartoon of a sad king trying to walk in stubby shoes, while being overtaken by a parade of flamboyant lords. Another features a courtier tiptoeing over the king's edict as if it were a puddle. The people laugh, the shoemakers cheer, and Charles V, he fumes. You, walking through the market district on a foggy morning, hear it in every whispered joke and rustling hem. The law is dead, long live the toe. But the law isn't entirely toothless. There are occasional arrests. A merchant in Rouen is fined for selling Poulaines beyond reasonable length. A cobbler in Dijon is dragged before a local magistrate, shoes in hand, forced to explain why a pair intended for a bishop's nephew included actual bird feathers stitched into the tips. As defense, spiritual elevation. The judge doesn't laugh. Still, the crackdowns are inconsistent and mostly symbolic. In practice, the bans do a little more than drive fashion into increasingly creative, subversive territory. Even the countryside gets in on the act. Rural nobles long behind city trends now jump into the game precisely because of the ban. Nothing makes something more desirable than being forbidden. A provincial count near Poitiers hosts a masquerade ball themed to the point of rebellion, where every guest is required to wear the longest shoes they can walk in. The winner reportedly made it 10 steps before collapsing into the punch. Another noble throws a dinner party where Poulaines are used as cutlery holders. Why not let the shoes do something useful? He quips, at this point, it's no longer about who started the trend, or even what it looks like. It's about participation in a cultural wink. Everyone's in on the joke. Everyone's still doing it anyway. And the king, oh, he notices it. Charles V responds with more fines, more decrees, and even a public demonstration in which he burns a dozen confiscated pairs in front of the cathedral incense. The ceremony is attended mostly by curious children and one annoyed bishop. The nobles meanwhile are off hosting their next secret fashion gala. So, as you walk the late-night streets, the moonlight catching on silver-tipped shoes that poke just a little too far out from velvet cloaks, you realize that the Poulaine has become more than a shoe. It's a flag. A sign that in the eternal war between fashion and authority, fashion just won. You awaken to the sound of distant clattering and echoing rhythm of wood on stone, toe on tile. It's morning in medieval Paris, and the cobbled streets are alive with motion. Merchants open their stalls, chickens flutter across alleyways, and nobles begin their daily and you're witnessing the dawn of something extraordinary and slightly ridiculous. Because now the Poulaine isn't just back, it's mutated. Charles V's royal ban may have attempted to muzzle the madness, but all it did was birth a second generation of shoes longer, louder, and even more structurally unhinged. We're now in the 1370s, and instead of vanishing, the long-toed shoe evolves like a stubborn species that refuses to go extinct. Shoemakers, part artisan, part mad scientists, begin pushing the limits of what a shoe even is. Designs become even more theatrical. The tips are now curved, arched, and occasionally twisted, like the horns of a goat, or the tail of a sleeping dragon. Some Poulaines now loop backward entirely, touching the ankle in a full circle. Historians still argue whether these elaborate forms were functional or simply worn for show appearances like medieval red carpet events. Either way, they're absurdly hard to walk in, and yet people wear them with pride. the construction evolves to tips are no longer just stiffened leather, they're engineered. Tailors start using bundled flax, whalebone slivers, and even boiled parchment to achieve a mix of stiffness and flexibility. It's the Gothic cathedral of footwear, designed delicate, complex, and always just one wrong step from collapse. And now we see they are measured, graded, and named like luxury car models. You have the moderate prong, 8 to 12 inches, ideal for formal settings and modest wealth. The knight's point, 15 to 20 inches, designed to impress at court. The lord's curl, minus 25 plus inches, often reinforced with brass and worn only indoors. The whispering serpent, rumored to have tips that swayed when the wearer walked, whispering against stone. Real, maybe. Iconic, absolutely. The shoe becomes more than a fashion statement, it becomes personal branding. Some nobles go as far as to embroider family crests or romantic messages on the toe. After all, that's the part most people are staring at anyway. One suitor famously stitched poor Moncard G. Tombe onto his Poulaines. He tripped 3 times at the ball that evening. It was perfect. You wander through a marketplace where Poulaines now outshine jewelry. Merchants hawk their own imitation versions, Paris points, and Burgundian slippers. Street musicians write little ditties about the hazards of love and long shoes. Even the children get in on the act. Wooden toy Poulaines become a minor craze. One young boy reportedly ties broom bristles to his toes to mimic the elite until he is chased by a goose. The goose wins. Meanwhile, the urban infrastructure starts to bend under the strain of all these elongated walkers. Tavern doorways are widened to accommodate the extra inches. Banquet tables are rearranged in horseshoe shapes to give guests space to splay their toes outward. One bishop even commissioned a pew modification after an entire row of nobles couldn't kneel without smacking their shoes into the altar rail. And weddings. Weddings become absolute poultry farms of pointed leather. There is a record of a noble couple in Lyon who asked guests to bring their longest pair to the ceremony. The entrance procession took nearly an hour, as guests shuffled sideways through the church doors, careful not to impale one another. The bride herself wore custom Poulaines in ivory satin, held aloft by 2 child attendants like a bridal train. One observer wrote, "She glided like a ship whose prow knew no wind," which sounds poetic until you remember she fell into a font 5 minutes later. But even amid the pageantry, practical problems persist. Shoes snap, people trip, and in one horrifying moment, a duke's curved Poulaine gets tangled in a tapestry, yanking down half a wall of embroidered family history during a feast. He attempts to style it out. He fails. You begin to hear murmurs of discomfort, not just physical, but social. Because for all its charm, the Poulaine is becoming a dividing line. In towns like Bordeaux and Tours, the working classes grow increasingly bitter. What started as a style symbol is now a walking punchline. Laborers mock the elite by crafting exaggerated Poulaines out of straw and scraps, parading around in what they call sabot de fou. Tensions brew. One chronicler notes a tavern fight that starts when a noble steps on a blacksmith's foot, his own elongated shoe causing more injury than a dagger might have. A carpenter yells, "If your lordship could walk like a man, we'd not be here today." A war of worlds, one of fashion, the other of function. Meanwhile, the medical community begins speaking up. Monastic infirmaries report a rise in foot deformities, stress fractures, and chronic joint pain, especially among older nobles who've worn Poulaines most of their lives. One monk even writes a treatise called De Tortura Pedum on the torture of the feet. In it, he claims, Poulaines are the devil's leash, stretching the soul through the toe. And yet, no one stops, because even when people know it's ridiculous, dangerous, and borderline self-parody, the Poulaine has become something much harder to shake. A cultural addiction. The longer the toe, the higher the fantasy. And in a world full of plague, political strife, and ever-creeping mortality, fantasy is exactly what people crave. You pause near the Seine as dusk sets in. Behind you, the sound of a dozen Poulaines tap and creak against stone, like a herd of fashion-obsessed deer. They hobble, strut, sway, and laugh, and you realize this is only the half. The flicker of torchlight dances across cold stone as you follow a group of nobles winding their way through a royal gallery. Their conversation is low and smug, and their shoes, gloriously unhinged. Tips curve like devil's horns. Some glitter with sequins, others are tipped in polished bronze. A few even jingle faintly with each step. Welcome to the era of competitive feet. We've passed mere fashion now. This is pageantry, theater, even aggressioner, toe war, for dominance. And you, poor listener, are watching the battlefield in real time. By the late 1370s, Poulaines are no longer just long, they're regulated within elite circles like hunting dogs or wine vintage. At the courts of Burgundy, Anjou, and Toulouse, nobles begin keeping log of who wore what to which event, and precisely how long their toes extended. One scribe even drew a graph to track the progression. The trends spike like fever charts. These aren't shoes anymore, they're reputations with laces. At a feast in Bourges, a count is shunned not because he said anything rude, but because his shoes were last season's length. His rivals Poulaines had an internal toe wire, which allowed them to hold a perfect spiral in damp weather. This, naturally, sparked an informal duel. The longer toes won, and so it begins. Toe envy. Fashion becomes a form of chezwan. False step, and you lose standing. Quite literally, nobles consult shoemakers, like their generals, plotting out public debuts, like campaign. We unveil the velvet pair at the midsummer ball, one duchess whispers, and then save the bone-tipped ones for the coronation. Yes, bone-tipped, that's where we are now. Historians still argue whether these bones came from animals or were carved from ivory, but the point was intimidation. At court, you didn't speak loudly, you just walked in and let your shoes do the talking. This escalation soon creates zones of danger. Banquet halls start spacing out tables to prevent guests from accidentally spearing one another under the tablecloth. You imagine the rustle of linen, followed by a noble yelp, as some extravagant curl brushes his leg. Several noble women begin using decorative guards' little padded wraps for their poulaines, like medieval shin guards, but for table etiquette. It doesn't stop there. Architecture begins to adjust. Stairs gain extra depth. Alcoves are widened. One palace in Dijon even installs a shoe rest beneath its prayer benches. The world is literally reshaping itself around this trend. But it's not all glamour. We now have reports of weaponized shoes, that is, poulaines so stiff and pointed that they're used in one scuffle outside a tavern, a nobleman fends off 2 thieves by kicking them in the ribs with his brass-tipped poulain. They flee. He limps away, triumphant, later quoted as saying, "My toes saved my coin." From there, it's a short leap to military concerns. Commanders begin complaining that young knights are arriving at training in flamboyant, impractical shoes. At least 2 cavalry drills are disrupted because someone couldn't mount a horse with their curved toes. One captain declares that Poulaines are the saboteurs of strategy and demands shorter footwear for all recruits. Some are bare, some just wear their long ones, under armor folded upward and tied with ribbons. Yes, really. Meanwhile, tailors push their art to absurd new height. Painted toes that mimic dragon scales, shoes with hidden compartments for notes, coins, or romantic tokens. Poulaines with scent sachets stitched into the tips, so the wearer leaves behind a trail of lavender or rosemary. It's like a medieval fragrance ad. Poulaine, for the man who doesn't walk he glides. One Parisian poet mocks this trend with a popular verse. He came with scent and velvet tip, but fell upon the baker's slip. His toe was long, his sense was thin, and now he's wed the chamber bin. Even the court jesters get in on it. Some begin performing Poulaine mimes, walking with exaggerated teetering steps, clinking their chain-tied toes together to comedic effect. One jester becomes famous for his act, the Duke's Disaster, a reenactment of a real noble stumbled down a staircase during a feast thanks, of course, to his boots. Yet beneath the laughter and spectacle, a quieter voice persists. Discomfort. We begin seeing letters between aristocrats expressing fatigue. One baron writes to his cousin, "I cannot rest. My feet ache constantly. My balance is poor, and I fear I shall perish in the next damp hall. Yet still, I wear them. For what is a man, if not his toe?" Another noble woman complains of numbness and cramping, yet refuses to downgrade her 22-inch curls because they cause envy. You pause by a cathedral as a line of penitents files out. Half of them shuffle in silence, not from reverence, but because their shoes are tied too tight. One poor friar offers benediction while subtly adjusting the strap on his left toe cup. And then in a court near Toulouse, a noble family is accused of smuggling illegal poulaines from Italy. The footwear in question includes exotic dyed leather and excessive length. Confiscation ensues. A formal apology is issued. The shoes are destroyed in a bonfire. And 3 weeks later, similar pairs begin appearing in Paris salons. You do the math. The cultural conversation is now polarized. On one side, tradition, elegance, and the right to look utterly fabulous. On the other, growing public mockery, injury, and whispers of royal impatience. But through it all, people keep walking, or hobbling, or teetering, because in this world where social standing is built on appearances and fashion as performance, you only as relevant as your reach. And in this era of competitive feet, reach begins at the floor and extends well beyond your toes. It's a crisp spring morning in Paris, and you're watching a man try to climb into a carriage. A wireless Poulaines are stiff, shimmering with gilded thread, and each toe tip sticks out a solid 2 feet. The poor valet tries to help, but every time one foot gets in, the other pivots dramatically sideways like an untrained marionette. You're witnessing a man lose a war to his own footwear. This is not unusual. It's the 1380s, and the age of the Poulaine is officially bloated. We are deep in the excess spiral now, where form has completely eclipsed function. The noble class no longer pretends that their shoes serve any purpose other than spectacle. These are not made for walking. These are status limsadons to your soul, stitched and perfumed. And so, the backlash builds again. This time, it's not from one frustrated king. This time, the pressure is coming from all sides. First, the public. Commoners are over it. Poulaines, once seen as aspirational, are now viewed with open contempt. Mockery is everywhere. In Paris taverns, satirical plays are staged where rich men are portrayed as clowns, tripping over their own shoes while trying to court ladies or flee debt collectors. There's even a puppet show titled The Long Toe of Lies. In one performance, a marionette noble tries to kneel before a queen but falls flat on his nose because his Poulaines get tangled. The crowd howls with laughter. Then there's the clergy, re-energized after 2 decades of spiritual huffing about sinful footwear. Bishops start writing again. This time, they get graphic. One Dominican sermon refers to Poulaines as foot-forged arrows, aimed at heaven itself. Another priest in Tours claims, long shoes make a man soul wander like a blind pig. A bishop in Avignon demands an exorcism of vanity be performed on every pair worn within cathedral walls. Spoiler, it's not well, but perhaps the sharpest spear comes not from a bishop or a bard but from a plague. Yes, as if fashion madness wasn't enough, the 1380s see a resurgence of the Black Death in waves, not as catastrophic as the first round, but brutal enough. And in a climate of death, suffering, and survivalist energy, the sight of men tottering through infected streets in 30-inch shoes starts to hit a little differently. One chronicler writes, "The rats returned, and so too did the folly. The Poulaine curled like a mocking smile above the grave." It's not exactly poetry, but it captures the vibe. There's a collective shift happening. People are beginning to see the shoes not as luxury but as lunacy, a grotesque symbol of detachment from the real world. And at court, whispers begin again. Should we ban them? Again, historians still argue whether this moment was planned or organic. But in 1382, in the city of Paris, the murmurs reached the ears of King Charles VI, the young successor of Charles V, only now in his early teens, and recently crowned. Charles VI is no pushover. Not yet. He's surrounded by advisors who remember the past law and urge him to act. If you do anything, they say, please shorten the toes. And so, the edict returns. This time it's broader and bolder. Poulaines exceeding 2 inches are banned once again, not just for courtiers, but for everyone, clergy, knight, or merchant. Penalties include confiscation, fines, and even public humiliation. In one city, violators are forced to stand barefoot in front of churches, holding their illegal shoes for everyone to mock. This works exactly as well as you'd expect. At first, the ban seems effective. Tailors are scared. Some burn their longer patterns, others shorten inventory, advertising their compliance with labels like King's Cut or the Modest Step. You'd think this would be the end. But then comes the loophole revolution. Designers adapt. They curve the shoes upward, arguing that vertical length is not the same as horizontal. Some introduce a slant toe, cutting diagonally from the tip to make them look shorter from the side. Others develop concealed extensions, padded toe boxers that appear modest from above but actually contain an inner pointed shell. Think of it as medieval heel inserts, but somehow sneakier. The court half-heartedly enforces. Royal guards fine peasants, but nobles with titles. They slide right through, and now you have a two-tiered world. The legal toe, worn by the cautious and the lower class, and the noble toe, hidden, opulent, and utterly undeterred. Even the military tries to adapt. In Burgundy, reports emerge of commanders ordering Poulaines for their officers only. They're trimmed, reinforced and curved downward to avoid battlefield accidents. One knight proudly boasts that his shoes cut down a blade before it touched my leg. Probably not true, but very on brand. Meanwhile, artists document it all. Manuscripts from this decade are littered with images of Longshoe, some lovingly rendered, others full of mockery. In one margin, a donkey wears Poulaines while reading scripture. In another, Death himself walks barefoot, looking over his shoulder at a group of nobles tumbling over their own toes. And throughout it all, people keep walking. Because here's the truth. No matter how many bans are passed, no matter how many sermons preached, the Poulaine has woven itself into the DNA of the age. It's not just a shoe, it's a story, a character, a lifestyle. You look out across a bridge at sunset, the Seine flickering below, and see two lovers holding hands, both wearing modest shoes. And behind them, a nobleman, cloak flapping, Poulaines bouncing slightly with each determined step. He may trip, but he'll look magnificent. The year is 1390, and you're standing on a polished stone floor in the palace, watching two men argue about toe curvature. One claims the proper angle for a ceremonial Poulaine tip is 45 degrees. The other insists 60 degrees adds height and gravitas. A third strolls past wearing tips so long and spiral-bound, they clink faintly, with every step clearly. Welcome to the mathematics of madness. The Poulaine has now entered its most technical phase. This isn't just about fashion anymore, it's about precision. Shoemakers begin consulting drafting tools. There are rumors of a tailor in Avignon who uses a wooden protractor to plan each curve, and an aristocrat in Champagne who keeps a notebook of sketches titled Forms Nobles Depied. Pun intended. Workshops are now part shoemaking studio, part geometry lab. Patterns are mapped, lengths calculated, and curves measured like celestial orbits. There's even talk of golden ratio Poulaine shoes designed to mathematically please the eye. Historians still argue whether any of these were real, or just branding by clever cobblers, desperate to keep the trend alive. And if you think this might finally bore the nobles, think again. In fact, we now see seasonal collections. Certain colors and fabrics dominate. Poulaines of soft blue and sagand are replaced by jewel tones and deep leathers in autumn. Parisian nobility hosts shoe viewing parties, where guests sip wine and show off their latest commissions like medieval runway models. Meanwhile, the rural elite try to keep up, but without access to the best tailors. Their Poulaines begin to look ... off too floppy, overstuffed. Some twist unintentionally, causing what one observer called the drunken goose walk. It becomes so common that children in Limoges invent a game where you imitate the wobbly stride until you fall over. Loser buys honey cakes, but this absurdity hides a new truth. The Poulaine is now political currency. Wearing them marks you as part of the ruling class, a signal that says, I am untouched by hardship, I can afford to walk slowly, and in a kingdom where famine, war, and disease routinely hammer the common folk, slow luxury is a kind of power. In response, sumptuary laws return again. This time they're regional. The Duchy of Berry limits Poulaines to no longer than 12 pusses, except on feast days. Normandy tries to ban them outright for clergy. In Tours, magistrates issue fines for shoemakers who create obviously flamboyant footwear. What qualifies as flamboyant? No one can agree. Some towns go further. They establish toe zones, safe areas where long shoes are prohibited due to crowding or safety concerns. Market lanes, church aisles, and theater galleries are among the restricted spaces. Offenders are told to remove their Poulaines or risk confiscation. Do people comply? Of course not. Instead, they develop the fold and walk technique, a method of temporarily bending the tip of the Poulaine back under the foot while walking through toe-free zone. Yes, people are now walking on their own shoe tips to obey the law, only to unfold them like paper fans when back in civilized company. And yes, it causes even more accidents. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire gets in on the act. Across the Rhine, Poulaines have spread to courts in Cologne and Prague. The German version called Schnabelschuh or Beakshoe evolves into its own beast. Unlike the French Poulaine, the Schnabelschuh is often stiffer, broader, and worn with thick tights and tunics. It's less about seduction, more about swagger. A German noble reportedly tells a French emissary, "We do not trip, we stride with sharp purpose." The emissary responds, "Sharp is right. I've seen less blade on a sword. Back in France, satire becomes civic duty. One monk writes a play called The Council of Shoes, in which various footwear types debate their place in society. The Poulaine is portrayed as a pompous constantly bumping into furniture and making philosophical declarations like, "My toe is my truth." The audience loves it. Even funerals aren't spared. A famous duke dies in 1393 and is buried with his Poulaines fully extended. The coffin must be custom built with a recessed toe chambers. One witness writes, "He went to heaven on his heels, but his soul followed some hours later." And yet, the cracks are forming. Privately, more nobles confess that Poulaines have become a burden. The weight, the balance, the risk. One countess writes to her sister, "I adore them, but I dream nightly of sandals." A knight with chronic hip pain blames decades of tabased swagger. Even a few clergy begin arguing for the shoes, but only so they can keep track of sinful behavior by sound. The jingle reveals the fool. One friar quips. Meanwhile, whispers reach the king again. Charles VI, still young but increasingly unpredictable, starts talking reform, not just of fashion but of the entire royal image. He's seen nobles fall over during processions. He's tripped on a banister himself. The Poulaine, once a joke, now reflects badly on his rule. So he consults his advisors, men who still wear short, safe, court-approved shoes on. Something's coming. But for now, the streets still echo with a click-clack of ridiculous elegance. And as you watch a group of ladies-in-waiting attempt a synchronized bow, one of them stuck midway because her Poulaine got caught in a decorative earnu, realize, we are approaching the end of an era. But like any great fashion, it won't go down quietly. The great bell of Notre Dame chimes as you walk along the Seine under a sky the color of tin. Behind you, a group of nobles picks their way across a narrow bridge, Poulaines swaying like pendulums. One slips slightly on the slick cobbles. A priest nearby snorts. The age of the pointed shoe is starting to wobble, and not just physically. Because by the early 1400s, France is changing. War is back. England invades. Again the 100 Years' War flares with renewed fury. Trade is disrupted. Grain prices skyrocket. People are tired, frightened, and no longer amused by nobles who topple over their own toes while peasants go hungry. There is a shift in mood, quiet but relentless. And the Poulaine. It begins to feel like a ghost from a sillier, more decadent time. Historians still argue whether it was war, plague, or fashion fatigue that delivered the final blow, but most agree on this. Sometime between 1410 and 1420, the shoe that conquered courts, broke bones, and required literal toe compartments, begins to die. You start seeing signs. First, among the military class, knights and officers abandon Poulaines entirely, not just for combat, but for formal occasion. They return to ankle-length boots, padded for protection, shaped for utility. A popular new style emerges, the duckbill shoe, blunt, flat, and wide. It looks like the Poulaine's cranky opposite. In a way, it is. The church rejoices. Sermons across France ring out with fire and brimstone triumph. The devil has withdrawn his tongue from your feet. The Lord no longer sees vanity in the house of prayer. Some priests even hold special services to bless the return of honest shoes. You imagine the pews filled with grateful groans and relieved toes. Then comes the satirical burial. In 1413, Paris hosts a strange carnival parade featuring a giant papier, shoe, carried by a dozen men. It is paraded through the streets and then symbolically burned in front of the royal palace. Children cheer. A banner reads, "Requiem for the Fool's Foot." But don't be fooled, this isn't yet total surrender. In private, some nobles cling to their toes like relics of identity. Secret salons are held where one might still catch a glimpse of a curled tip peeking from beneath velvet. A few, especially stubborn dukes, refuse to let go, commissioning reduced Poulaines, just long enough to pass as modern, but curved just enough to declare, "I remember." A silent resistance. Tailors, ever practical, begin repurposing old Poulaines. One merchant in Lyon cuts them down and reshapes them into soft house slippers, lining the insides with rabbit fur. Another transforms unused tips into coin purses. A noblewoman reportedly wears one around her waist like a fashion statement. A fallen toe turned treasure. Meanwhile, Europe at large is moving on. In England, the Poulaine has already peaked and fizzled. Henry V, never a fan of fashion nonsense, bans them outright for his court in 1419. Let men walk straight and think straight, he's said to have muttered. Whether true or apocryphal, his court soon mirrors his blunt practicality. In Italy, fashion begins to turn more angular, more vertical. Heeled footwear emerges, not dramatic, not yet stiletto, but a whisper of what's to come. The focus shifts upward. 2 hats, 2 posture, 2 shoulders, and in Germany, the Schnabelschuh is retired in favor of round-toed boots and more militarized dress. The bird has flown. By 1420, Poulaines are officially unfashionable. Royal portraits no longer feature them. Laws are no longer needed because no one's wearing them. Cobblers begin training apprentices in new methods. Rounded lasts, stitched soles, minimal curvature. The same artisans who once measured toe angles like astronomers now teach how to balance heel support and ankle grip. You pause at a market stall where a young apprentice sharpens a cobbling knife. His master says, "We don't make those anymore." The boy nods. But you can tell he's curious, because something this iconic doesn't vanish completely. It lingers. In stories, in jokes, in family lore. Children still play games where they teeter in long shoes made from bundled hay. Lovers still whisper about secret courtships, wrapped in curling toes. Even peasants smirk when recalling the noble who'd tripped into a pig trough during a wedding. The Poulaine becomes a memory artifact, an object that tells 1,000 stories without needing to exist anymore. And quietly, fashion begins to democratize. Not fully, not even close, but the line between noble and merchant begins to blur. Cities rise. Guilds gain power. Middle-class wealth starts to influence. A tailor in Rouen now matters more than a lord in the countryside. Footwear, too, reflects this new modesty. Shoes shrink. The silhouette simplifies. A new favorite emerges. The ankle boot, soft leather, buckle-fastened, practical, confident, unapologetically plain. And yet, late at night, in the back of a dusty shop, you might find a reliquant final, impossibly long, beautifully embroidered Poulaine. Maybe it's nailed above a doorway. Maybe it's tucked into a chest with cedar wood and regrets. You hold it in your hands, and you imagine the world it walked through: lavish halls, muddy alleys, war zones, banquets, and courtrooms. The stumbles, the swagger, the laughter, the scorn. It is absurd. It is majestic. It's a rainy afternoon in Rouen, and you're watching a merchant walk confidently across the square in simple brown boots. No curves, no tips, no jokes. He moves fast, elegantly, practical, and no one bats an eye. Not long ago, such plainness might have invited whispers. Now it commands quiet respect. You're witnessing the full afterlife of the Poulaine. By the mid-1400s, fashion in France has taken a sharp turn toward restraint. The pendulum has swung. Shoes are shorter, sturdier, and some might say finally sensible. But don't mistake this for mere functionalism. The memory of the long-toed era still lingers, etched in both culture and caution. In fact, some aristocrats begin dressing more modestly on purpose as a form of signaling. Not humility, exactly, but a kind of moral superiority. You can practically hear the subtext in their walk. See, I can be powerful without looking ridiculous. It's the same flex, just quieter. Meanwhile, the urban middle class has stepped fully into the fashion spotlight. Guild members, prosperous merchants, and city officials are now the ones shaping style. Their shoes, modest yet polished, become the new gold standard. Soft leather, decorative buckles, subtle embossed patterns. Still beautiful. Jazz ... grounded. Tailors who once spent weeks perfecting toe curvature now rebrand themselves as urban outfitters, craftsmen of the modern silhouette. They offer boots for every mood and station. Sturdy for travel, slippery smooth for dancing, fitted for court, trimmed with satin or fur. One tailor even names his signature line Les Piges, raisonnables, the reasonable feet. They sell out across Paris. But make no mistake, the Poulaine didn't die. It transformed. It becomes a symbol, a reference point, even a teaching tool. In schools, young scribes copy illustrations of outlandish 14th century fashion in the margins of manuscripts. One drawing shows a knight with Poulaines so long they wrap around his waist like a belt. Another depicts death in fashionable shoes, kicking over gravestones. And then there are the moral fables. In the countryside, traveling friars tell tales of nobles who fell from grace literary because their shoes outran their souls. One such tale involves a baron who dared God to follow the path of my toe, only to be struck by lightning. It's theologically flimsy, but the kids love it. Historians still debate whether these tales were originally satire or genuine moral instruction. Probably both. In the end, the shoe becomes a stand-in for vanity itself. To Poulaine even slips into local slang meaning to overdo something stupidly. He Poulained the deal equals he overplayed his hand. You stroll into a small chapel and notice something odd carved into a pew. A pair of long, curling shoes, etched beside a modest prayer. The artisan clearly remembered the era. He probably laughed as he carved it. Maybe he wore a pair once himself. Even in literature, the Poulaine lives on. In a romance from 1460, a noblewoman tests her suitor's devotion by demanding he shorten his shoes. If you love me, you'll let your feet be free. He does, they marry. The moral, love is truer than fashion. The subtext, be careful who ties your laces. And yet, fashion is already shifting again. You begin to hear rumors of Italian courts where men are raising their heels just a little. Not for combat, not for necessity, but for posture, presence, height. Another form of artifice is taking root. Not the long toe, but the elevated foot. The human urge to decorate, to exaggerate, to outdo it, never really ends. It just changes shape. One older noble, now retired from court, puts it perfectly. We walked on foolish feet for decades, but we walked, and that's the point. The shoes carried us through our own madness. You sip watered wine in a smoky tavern as two young men argue about whether fur-lined boots are a sign of effeminacy or just comfort. You smile. They have no idea how silly things used to get. Across the room, a dusty old Poulaine hangs above the hearthrug like a question mark, dangling with gentle absurdity. No one comments on it anymore, it's just there. A relic, a conversation piece for those who know. But occasionally, someone still tries. In 1465, a rebellious noble in Bordeaux commissions a new pair of Poulaines as a joke. He wears them to a banquet. People laugh, toast him, slap his back, but no one copies him. The trend doesn't return. His gesture is met with nostalgia, not revival. The world has moved on, because that's what trends do. They flare, peak, collapse, and become memory. Some linger as ghosts, others as punch, but all of them, for a moment, were everything. And that's the strange power of the Poulaine. It was ridiculous, excessive, and wildly impractical, but it was also beautiful, expressive, and human. A toe-stretched cry of identity in a world filled with plagues, politics, and papal edicts. You glance down at your own modern shoe scuffed, serviceable, simple, and wonder, what will future generations mock about us? Spoiler, it's early morning in a chilly manuscript room, and you're watching a scribe dip his quill into ink. He pauses, smirks slightly, and in the margin of an otherwise serious genealogy, he sketches a tiny nobleman, tripping over an absurdly long Poulaine. The noble's wig is flying, his arms outstretched, and a passing duck looks on unimpressed. Even decades later, the joke still lands, because by the late 15th century, the Poulaine has fully crossed from fashion into folklore. The long-toed shoe is no longer just a memoret, it has become a symbol of the past. The good, the bad, and the fantastically ridiculous. And people are beginning to codify their past. Writers, artists, and early historians start to assemble cultural accounts of the 1300s and 1400s. And the Poulaine always makes the highlight reel. You see it in frescoes, where saints are depicted crushing demons that suspiciously resemble nobles in curled shoes. You hear it in songs sung by children's simple tunes that rhyme toe with woe, and warn against walking farther than your soul can follow. In Florence, a group of young painters begins to depict medieval excess in bright, cartoonish style. One famous panel titled The Fall of Vanity, a rich man ascending to heaven in a Poulaine. So long it blocks the door to paradise. An angel sighs. It's not just satire anymore. It's moral memory. Scholars today still argue whether this memory was accurate or exaggerated, and to what degree the medieval people actually saw the Poulaine as shameful by the time it faded. What we know is this: it stuck. People wanted it to mean something. Because when a culture moves on from its absurdities, it needs to assign them purpose. Otherwise, what was the point? And so the Poulaine becomes the mascot of foolishness, of pride, of all the ways we forget to walk with both feet on the ground. Think of it as the medieval version of a mullet, except you had to physically train to use it properly. But some communities take it even further. In certain towns, annual Fool's Day festivals include a traditional skit called the Toe Duel, where two actors dressed in long shoes made of paper and string battle by trying to knock each other over without using their hands. The audience bets on the winner, and the loser is doused in goose feathers. It's nonsense. It's glorious, and its history being playfully reanimated. Meanwhile, scholars begin to document fashion history more deliberately. In 1494, a monk named Guillaume of Blois compiles a manuscript of ecclesiastical warnings from the last century. Entire pages are devoted to footwear. One section marked with a frowning cherub features a drawing of a bishop scolding a noble with pointy shoes that poke through the church doors. Guillaume writes, "There were days when a man's soul might wait outside, while his feet entered in sin." Dramatic, yes, but poetic. Even tailors' guilds adopt the Poulaine as a teaching tool. Apprentices in Paris are shown woodcuts of various shoe silhouettes over the decades. The long-toed shoe, labeled the mistake, a master tailor reportedly says, "We learned to stretch, then we learned to balance." It becomes a saying like a motto etched on a dusty wall. And just as you think it's all settled history, there's a ripple. In early 1500s, England, under Henry VIII, a short-lived footwear style appears. Slightly elongated square-toed shoes, with flared sides and wide insoles. They're not Poulaine-level absurd, but some of the detailing echoes the old curve. Court gossip calls them Duke shoes. A few old-timers mutter, the toe returns. It doesn't stick, but it reminds everyone. These things never vanish entirely, because fashion isn't just cloth and leather, it's a cycle. A conversation between generations. One era mocks the last, and the next one revives it with irony. You wonder if, centuries from now, someone will wear exaggerated shoes again, not to belong, but to stand out. Spoiler, just wait for the platform boots of the 1970s. Back in France, older noble families pass down family portraits with subtle pride. One features an ancestor standing nobly, 1 foot forward, his toes curling out like a musical clef. His expression says, "Yes, I walked like this. And yes, I was magnificent." You find yourself lingering at a tiny museum in a provincial town, one dedicated solely to fashion oddities. In a glass case sits a preserved Poulaine, deep blue leather, trimmed in brass, the tip curved into a neat spiral. The card beside it reads, "Late 14th century, recovered from a noble's tomb, cause of death unknown," but balance was likely an issue. Even now, centuries later, people can't resist the joke. A school group passes by. One child presses their nose to the glass and whispers, "How did they walk?" The teacher answers with a smile, badly, but proudly. And maybe that's the best summary yet. Because even as the centuries wear on, and the world reshapes itself through revolutions, renaissances, and reformations, the memory of the Poulaine holds. It endures not because it was practical, but because it was audacious, outrageous, unapologetically human. And that's what history really is. Not just facts, not just dates, but the long, curling story of everything we tried, failed, loved, mocked, and wore with absurd confidence even when the sun sets slowly over the tiled roofs of Paris, casting a warm glow over narrow streets where shadows stretch long and gentle. You find yourself in a quiet corner of the city, beneath an ancient stone archway, where time seems to fold back on itself. Here the echo of footsteps carries faintly a blend of clacks and thuds, some deliberate, some accidental, like a distant chorus of long-gone nobles struggling to walk with style. The story of the Poulaine reaches its final act. By now, the age of the pointed shoe is firmly behind Europe, but its influence lingers quietly beneath the surface of history and culture. We've seen it as a symbol of excess, identity, and failure, dance between power and impracticality, vanity and vulnerability. You might wonder, what lessons did those absurd curling toes leave us? First, they remind us that fashion is never just fashion. It's a language, a symbol, a political statement. When a king bans a shoe but no one listens, it reveals something deeper about power and resistance, conformity and rebellion. Second, the Poulaine teaches us about human nature, how we strive to stand out, to be seen, to claim status, even when it means tripping over our own ambitions. And it shows how societies oscillate between embracing and rejecting such displays. And third, it whispers a gentle caution that every trend has its limits, even if those limits are only recognized decades or centuries later. As you walk forward, your feet firmly on the cobblestones, you carry these echoes with you. The world you live in is shaped not just by great events or heroic deeds, but also by the small, absurd choices people made, like deciding to wear shoes 2 feet long. And isn't that oddly comforting? Because it means history is full of laughter, stumbles, and strange beauty. It means that sometimes the most ridiculous things leave the biggest marks. So, as the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, picture once more those long, curling toes navigating shadowed halls, muddy fields, and glittering courts. Remember the kings who tried to control them, the tailors who celebrated them, and the people who lived, loved, and laughed in their wake. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Now, take a deep breath, feel your feet grounded, and let the gentle rhythm of history lull you into calm. Sleep well, sweet.